Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for the next episode of Ships of War, the series in which I look at historic ships, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious. And what I do in these programs is I try to situate them within their historical context, and also look at how they might have been presented in a particular game system. And assess whether the representation of these ships within that game system is fair or whether perhaps it could do with some tweaking. Now, today I'm going to return to a system that I'm very fond of. It's Avalanche Press's The Great War at Sea system. In the past, I have visited the First World War side of Great War at Sea, which is really what gave the series its birth before it branched out in opposite directions chronologically. Now I'm going to look at two of the ships from the SOPAC or South Pacific module, which deals with the Second World War in the Solomon Islands between 1942 and 1943. And today's antagonists will probably need very little introduction to those of you who know the campaign well. I have the United States Navy's heavy cruiser USS Astoria and the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy cruiser HIJMS Chokai. Now, I think these two make great antagonists because there are quite a lot of parallels in their lives, and they were, in fact, destined to meet in combat one terrible night in early August 1942 at the Battle of Savo Island. It was the only time the two ships really sighted and fought one another, albeit indirectly. They were both part of opposing squadrons. And I'm afraid the results were rather terminal for the poor Astoria, but more on that later. So what I'm going to do, as per the usual, is I'm going to dive into the history of the two ships and talk a bit about their specifications and what informed their development. But before I proceed to that, you can see I've got out the two counters from the game for the two ships. I really love the artistry in the Great War at Sea series. You've got these beautiful coloured top-down views. But something that was introduced in SOPAC, which I really enjoyed, was the option of having a silhouette, if you preferred that to the top down. Now, I'm quite a fan of the top down, so I'll leave that side up. So before I get going, just a reminder about what the counters show, especially for those of you who've never seen this game system before. So the ship graphic is obvious. CA is the numeric designation for the cruisers. That and the national flags have no effect on gameplay. The numbers here at the middle top of the counter is the ship's speed. And you see that Chokai has been credited with a slight edge over the Astoria. She has 3+, and the Astoria has 3. Both are in a boxed background, which does have an impact on gameplay. There's various grades of speed in this game. The three numbers from left to right are primary armament, that relates to guns of roughly 10-inch or greater, of which neither cruiser had any. The middle one is tertiary armament, in this case sort of guns of roughly 6-inch up to 9 point something. Basically lower than 10, 6 or better. And you can see again, Chokai has been given a very slight edge over the Astoria. We'll look at that in more detail later. And finally, the third number is the tertiary armament. So these are the really light guns, sort of 5-inch and smaller. And both have broken even there with 1 each. Chokai has a little Imperial chrysanthemum there, which does have a game impact. This ship had a very lucky reputation, and thematically, I like that that's been included to symbolize the lucky Chokai. In game terms, it allows her to re-roll dice, particularly in circumstances where she's likely to be destroyed. Quite a nice touch there. The aircraft in the box represents the presence of search planes. The blue box indicates that both had a significant number of these aircraft. The number in the green box is the torpedo battery. Here, Chokai has a massive edge over Astoria. And lastly, the number inside the red crosshairs is the anti-aircraft rating. That's a feature you don't see given in the First World War game, but obviously by the 1940s, it was a fairly major thing. So let's dive into the history. Now, I'd mentioned that the two ships had slightly parallel lives and parallel developments, and that's very true. They were launched within a very short time of each other. The USS Astoria was completed and entered service in 1934, and HIJMS Chokai entered service slightly earlier in 1932. They both represented efforts by their respective navies to grapple with the problems and also the opportunities that had been offered by the restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty. So you get the awkwardness around cruiser types, which you can where the limitations say, oh, you've got to have the hulls up to a certain level, but you've also got to have a limit on your armament of 8-inch guns, and there's the weight limit of 10,000 tons. So effectively, the stipulations of Washington gave birth to what was known as the treaty cruiser, where participating navies built up to the maximum they could squeeze in. So you get these slew of 8-inch cruiser designs, some of which are quite imaginative, but ultimately they're not all that satisfactory as ships because compromises never are. So by the time USS Astoria and her sisters, the New Orleans class, were designed and conceived, you have a design that's been reiterated a few times throughout the 1920s. And the New Orleans and her sisters were really meant to be the apogee of the treaty type cruiser before the United States Navy began to exploit ways of improving on this design and even in important ways moving away from it. So when Astoria comes into being, she does represent an improvement upon her near sisters, let me say, because she looks a lot like them, but she is somewhat better armored than they are. The US was really trying hard to reach this level where they could pack in a decent armament, but they were painfully aware that the protection built into their earlier ships was not as good as it should have been, and they wanted to come up with something more balanced. With the Chokai, the Japanese were trying for something rather different. Their whole philosophy was built around maximizing the offensive potential of their cruisers. Now, this was very important for them because the other stipulations of the Washington Treaty had locked the Japanese into a situation where they could only build up key fleet units to a ratio of 7 for every 10 the United States Navy had. Now, realistically, the Japanese economy and shipbuilding industry would never have allowed them to compete with the US Navy on a ship-for-ship basis. But irrespective of that, the Japanese, thwarted in that ambition by the treaty, looked at other ways of making the most of what they could build. And what they wanted was qualitative superiority in terms of combat capability, and everything was sacrificed to this. So Chokai was designed to be fast, and she and her 3 sisters were also armed with a truly formidable armament. They were supposed to be like the Astoria was with preceding US heavy cruiser designs. Chokai and her sisters were supposed to be an improvement on the preceding Nachi class heavy cruisers. Now, the Nachis are interesting ships. They are supposedly treaty compliant, but the Japanese were already cutting corners. And with the Chokai, they wanted to make the concept even better. But even with a bit of cheating, something had to give somewhere. And so when she is launched and then later completed, in certain respects, Chokai is not only a little bit overweight, she also has certain structural weaknesses which need to be addressed, because when you maximize your firepower and your speed, your protection does suffer a bit. But nonetheless, both sides were able to create very interesting ships. And as I say, they were both launched within 2 years of each other and completed within 2 years of each other, which is really close. And they come into service at a fairly pivotal moment where the 1920s and all that represented in naval architecture has given way to the 1930s. And the Japanese ship in particular has this wonderfully distinctive profile. It really is something. You would recognize a Japanese ship instantly. And Chokai and her sisters are particularly recognizable on account of the massive bridge structure, really enormous for a cruiser, as you can see. In fact, if you want an even closer look at it, there we go. The thing is humongous. And what this represents is the Japanese attempt to really, really pile in decent command and control systems, not only furthering the capabilities of the ship itself, but also allowing them to function as squadron flagships and advanced fleet scouts. So you have room for an admiral and his staff. You have very advanced communications facilities. A lot of it, of course, is given over to fire control. So there's a lot happening on these ships. And you might notice the very interesting run of the upper deck. That's very artistic and quite uniquely Japanese, but it also had an important weight-saving purpose. They were squeezing everything they could out of this design and pushing the envelope as far as they could. Now, the US ship, by contrast, looks a good deal more conventional. If I just find a picture, maybe a profile of, here we go. So that is the USS Astoria as new. And to Westernize, you know, she's quite a nice conventional cruiser. US treaty cruisers had a very handsome profile anyway. They both had a very similar primary battery. The USS Astoria had 9 8-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets. Compare this with the Japanese ship, which had 10 8-inch guns in twin turrets, 3 forward of the superstructure and 2 aft, so 1 barrel's difference. They both had a fairly similar number of lighter weapons. One critical area where they differed was in torpedoes. As you've seen from the counter earlier, the US cruiser had no torpedoes whatsoever, whereas the Japanese had 2 pairs of twinned torpedo tubes either side of the ship. You can see them there, looking fairly menacing in their mountings. As part of overcoming their material inferiority, or I should say numerical inferiority, the Japanese were really keen to level the playing field by developing very capable torpedoes and arming their surface ships with as many of them as possible. The US Navy, by contrast, had drawn very different lessons from the First World War and naval thought since then throughout the 20s. So as far as they were concerned, it was not the job of their heavy cruisers to chuck torpedoes at other ships. And so it meant that Astoria and all the cruisers that preceded her, at least those that were heavy, had no torpedoes at all. And this was to prove a very serious weakness during the Pacific War. So very decent gun batteries, but unfortunately not all that much behind it. Now, when we think about their careers, with both ships entering service in the very early 1930s and pretty much finding themselves in a state of war less than a decade later, there wasn't really that much that was altered about them. The main improvements, curiously enough, in both vessels came in upgrades to their secondary armament, particularly on Chokai. So Chokai originally began with 4 4.7-inch anti-aircraft guns, and this was basically her heavy anti-aircraft battery. In 1940, this was upgraded to 8 5-inch in 4 twin mounts, so quite a significant increase. The United States ship had an increase in the number of machine guns that she had, but she generally retained her 8 5-inch in unshielded single mounts, and these were clustered around the superstructure. I may have a photograph where you can see some of them. Here we go. So this is an aerial view of Astoria taken in 1942, just a month or two before she was lost, really. And it's a bit of a grainy picture, but you can see her, and excuse me, you can see her anti-aircraft mountings in their positions around merely around the forward superstructure and the two funnels. That was a good place to concentrate them. And if the guns themselves are not very visible, you can see the shadow of the sponsons from their mountings. Chokai had her secondary armament in a very similar sort of place. So for all their differences, there were some things the designers of the two ships were coming to similar conclusions on. So here is Chokai as completed, and you can just about see one single mount there and another single mount there. When they were converted to twin mounts, they effectively remained in the same place. So what about their meeting at the Battle of Savo Island? Well, sorry to say for the US side, Savo Island was one of the greatest surface victories the Japanese Navy achieved during the Second World War. They sank or damaged nearly every Allied heavy ship that stood in their path, and it was only their withdrawal without attacking the US transports off Guadalcanal that prevented the outcome of the battle for being a strategic as well as a tactical disaster for the Allies. Thanks to the Japanese retreat and the survival of the transports, the US Marines were able to hang on at Guadalcanal, and the rest, as they say, is history. But that probably represented the moment of greatest threat to the US position in August 1942. On the Japanese side, there wasn't that much to criticize. They made a few minor tactical mistakes in detail, but on the whole, Admiral Mikawa handled his ships superbly, and regrettably, the Allies paid the price. Chokai emerged from that battle with fairly minor damage. Astoria was sunk outright, as were two of her sisters in the New Orleans class. A very disappointing result for the US designers, given that they'd worked extra protection into these ships. But perhaps not a very fair reflection on that aspect of their design, because there is only so much damage a ship can take, no matter how well built it was. And unfortunately, on that terrible night, the Imperial Navy was on the top of its game, and the US and Allied navies, unfortunately, were not. But of course, that was the end of Astoria's career and the midpoint of Chokai's. What had they done before that? So Chokai, and this is a picture of her taken in November 1942 at Truk Lagoon. You can see Yamato hiding in the background there. And you can also note that she's not hugely altered from her pre-war days. So Chokai had been in the Pacific War pretty much from the start. She was involved in virtually every Japanese every Japanese amphibious operation throughout Southeast Asia. She didn't really participate in any of the carrier campaigns, although she did go as part of a separate force into the Indian Ocean in April 1942. But her direct contact with the U.S. Navy in terms of the Guadalcanal campaign didn't really begin till August, where she was available at Rabaul when Mikawa needed a flagship. After the Guadalcanal campaign, she went on to see extensive service until the Leyte Gulf campaign, where she was sunk by a combination of US Navy bombers and destroyer gunfire in October 1944. Astoria, by contrast, participated very extensively in the war as well, but she accompanied the carrier task forces, and she ended up taking part in just about every major carrier operation. So she was there at the Battle of the Coral Sea, she was present at the Battle of Midway. And it was only, ironically enough, when she was committed to the very surface role that she had been designed to perform off the coast of Guadalcanal that she came to grief. So a very sad end for a very handsome ship. But that takes me nicely into the question of the game ratings and how fair they are. So the first thing I want to think about really is survivability overall, because another aspect of the Great War at Sea system is that they have damage data charts for the ships that count how many hull boxes they have and how well protected the areas are. So I want to start with survivability, which in game terms really equates to how many hull boxes you have. Now the game gives Chokai 7 hull boxes, and it gives the Astoria 5. Now this raised a bit of an eyebrow with me because I overall the Japanese ship was somewhat better armored than her US counterpart, but only in very specific areas. Broadly speaking, it was actually the US ship that enjoyed better protection. And not only that, looking at the ships in their unloaded state and even in their sort of ready for war state, in terms of the number of vulnerable areas and their survivability in terms of internal compartmentalization, there wasn't actually that much difference between the two ships. In fact, you could argue that the protective arrangements in aggregate, in terms of watertight subdivision, pumping systems to keep the water at bay, and if you factor in the slightly better US damage control, I would suggest that the two should actually have the same number of hull boxes. I wonder if the game designers gave Chokai a couple more on account of her significantly greater length. So she topped out at just over 660 feet compared to the Astoria just being a bit short of 590. But okay, so Chokai had the great length, which probably helped her speed in terms of hull form. But her beam was only a bit over 58, 59 foot in length, while the USS Astoria was 60, 61 foot in beam, sorry. So Chokai was 59 foot and a smidge in beam, and Astoria was 61 foot and a bit in the beam. So only slightly wider than the Japanese ship. But I think that could do with a revisit, because in terms of absorbing hits that cause flooding, the Japanese ship has a significant advantage in the game, possibly more than she actually merits. What about the speed? So both ships had high performance turbines driving 4 propellers, so 4 shafts. Chokai did have an edge. On trials, she slightly exceeded 35 knots, and she was able to maintain that speed for most of her career and maintain it pretty easily. Her machinery was very efficient. The USS Astoria did similarly well on trials, but for most of her career, 32 was about the best she could log most of the time. So in terms of tactical maneuvering, a 3-knot advantage can be fairly significant under some conditions. So fair enough, a 3 versus a 3 plus, I think that's a fair rating to give the Chokai. Armament. I've talked briefly about the 8-inch guns and the fact that Chokai had 1 more than the Astoria. As to whether they were effectively distributed is another question. There was a lot of debate in the 20s, mainly the early 20s, about whether the triple turret or the twin turret was more effective. The Japanese seem to have thought that the twin arrangement was more effective for offensive purposes and that the triple was better for defensive. you could argue the toss on that one quite a bit. I mean, one thing in favour of having a greater number of twins is that there's more to be knocked out before you deplete a ship's armament. However, hits in the vicinity of tightly grouped turrets could take out more than one, so it's not that great an argument, really. But then conversely, if you consider the opposite side of it, having fewer turrets can be a weakness too. And there were quite a few who believed at the time, and even a bit after, that having triple turrets put too many of your eggs in one basket. But in terms of the armament overall, they are quite evenly matched. And maybe the designers have favoured Chokai a bit again, but 7-6 in terms of the ratings they've been given, I'll lean on the side of saying that's fair. I mean, you don't really want to get into fractions with this game system. Now, with the tertiary guns, the really light one, the 5-inch in the case of, by this point in their careers, both the Astoria and the Chokai. So I touched on the upgrades that Chokai had had. So she has 8 5-inch, and the USS Astoria has 8 5-inch singles as well. Chokais were arguably better protected, but you could argue that their effectiveness was limited by the fact that they were twinned in rather clumsy turret-type mountings. So the two ratings seem to balance each other out fairly well. I'll give them that. I think that's a fair rating. Aircraft, they've both been given the same level of capability in terms of spotting planes. So Chokai, by the Second World War, carried 3 aircraft, the same number she'd always carried. Mostly a mix of the early Japanese float plane types. Alfs later on would have had Pete's, the F-1M. I don't know if she ever carried any of the modern E-13 Jake reconnaissance aircraft, but she may well have done at points in her career. Astoria always had the very reliable US Navy Seagull, and she had, sorry, not the Seagull, it was the Kingfisher, I believe. And she carried 4 of them. So very closely matched there. Torpedoes, yes, by the Second World War, and indeed actually at the start of her career, Chokai had a very impressive torpedo battery, not only potentially having the capability to launch 4 torpedo salvos, that is salvos of 4 torpedoes at a time, but Japanese ships were equipped to be able to reload their torpedo tubes quickly at sea, which was not a capability many other ships had at the time. Astoria, as we've seen, was not equipped with torpedo tubes at all, which was a major weakness for her. So, yes, a very decent rating. The anti-aircraft ratings are an interesting one because as the war progressed, US anti-aircraft systems proved much more effective than their Japanese counterparts. But in 1942, the picture was somewhat more closely balanced. So Astoria never lived long enough to receive the modifications that many of her surviving sisters did from late 1942 onwards. And so same as Chokai, she has the same number of anti-aircraft guns, give or take a few heavy machine guns here. Both suffer from what would have been regarded as subpar detection and targeting systems to guide their anti-aircraft guns in the summer of 1942. So I think it's fair that they've been given a rating, I think based on their gun caliber. If you really wanted to argue that the US did have a slight edge, and there is room for arguing that, it's an ongoing debate, then perhaps Chokai should be downgraded to 1. Because as I've mentioned in other videos, while their heavy guns were quite respectable, they lacked decent targeting systems to bear them effectively onto aircraft, and their 25mm armament was really not up to the job because of its very limited range. Lots of sound and fury, but nothing concrete. So there we go. I think that wraps us up on these two very, very interesting ships. Um, in many ways, they had a lot in common, but in many ways, they were equally quite different. And they reflected design philosophies which were really after different things. So, with the Astoria, you get the effort to produce a very decent heavy cruiser that's an all-rounder and yet fits into the restrictive straitjacket of the Washington Naval Treaty. And despite the terrible blot on their record that the Battle of Savo Island tends to give the New Orleans class, I think in the context of their time, they were extremely good ships. And as the four surviving members of the class, all of whom served through to the end of the war, proved, they were actually a good investment. The disaster which befell three of them at Savo Island shouldn't really obscure that. Now, as for Chokai, the very handsome Chokai and her sisters, very, very capable warships. I don't think anyone would ever argue they weren't. A superb example of the imagination showed by Japanese naval architecture in terms of trying to force fit an almost impossible concept into a certain tonnage. I'm actually quite amazed that the heaviest member of the class topped out at about 12,900 tons, which is quite a lot over the 10,000 stipulated by treaty. But when you consider the sheer amount of fighting power and speed that was packed into this design, very advanced for its time, hats off to them for managing it without going even further overweight. So another very, very awesome warship. Now, of course, as with most of the Imperial Navy, none of the class survived the end of the Second World War. They were either sunk at sea or damaged so badly as to be written off and scuttled. So that was the sad end of the four ships of the Chokai class. And there's also a slightly eloquent comment there in the fact that there were only four versus the seven Astorias. Already you see the difference in shipbuilding capacity between the two sides. But I'll leave these antagonists there. I really must get another game in sometime with these two, break out Sopak and do something with it. As always, thank you all so much for following this video and this series. I really hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting. If this is the first of my Ships of War videos you've watched, I do invite you to have a look at some of the others if you're interested in this kind of thing. If you came here because of SOPAC or the Great War at Sea system, you're very welcome. And indeed, if it was wargaming in general that brought you here, lovely to have you on board. Big hello as always to my long-suffering, long-serving veterans. And to any newcomers, a very warm welcome to the channel. Thank you guys again for the pleasure of your company. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. But whoever you are, wherever you're watching from, thank you again. And until our next meeting, do take care. All